I am Behruz Ghamadi Tabrizi. I'm the director of Sharmin Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. At the end of this semester, there's going to be a quiz. I will ask you, who am I? You get free lunch if the answer is correct. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor Niki Akhavan, a good friend for many years and one of those rare creative scholars who comes from one of the places that has produced generation after generation of creative scholars in American academia, History of Consciousness program at the University of California in Santa Cruz. I am a little bit biased towards Santa Cruz because I come from Santa Cruz myself, so I should put my biases on the table. Professor Akhavan is chair of Department of Media and Communication Studies at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. She's the author of Electronic Iran, The Politics of an Online Evolution, which came out in almost 10 years ago by Rutgers Press. And really, Niki was one of the pioneers of studying the cyber world and what became known as Blogistan. And one of the very early kind of studies of that sphere was partly the contribution that Niki has made to the field of media studies and Iranian studies. And she has also published on Iranian narrative and documentary cinema, Iranian sports and media, as well as on state media productions and policies. She has been also an important translator of Persian work into English. Most recently, Mohsen Kadivar's book, Human Rights and Reformist Islam, that came out in 2021 by Edinburgh University Press. She is really one of those important emerging and already emerged scholars of Iranian studies. And it's really a pleasure to have her here, and hopefully this project would eventually turn into a wonderful book for which we would invite her back here for a book launch. So please help me to welcome Niki Akhavan.
Okay, I've turned this on. I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much for this generous introduction. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you to the center. Thank you to Allison. You guys have a very smooth operation here. Everything has gone smoothly so far, and I hope my talk will also go smoothly. I realized just yesterday that this is the first time that I'm doing a presentation in person post-pandemic. So if there's any awkwardness, you know who to blame it on. It's the pandemic. It's the virus. As Behruz indicated in his introduction, a lot of my work has focused on state-sponsored media, state-sponsored cultural productions. So for many years, the state-sponsored Iran-Iraq war cultural productions were always on my radar. I did even talk about them in my 2013 book. That body of work is known inside Iran as sacred defense. That's how the Iran-Iraq war and all the cultural productions around it are called in the official discourses, and that's the moniker that I'm going to use for it today. Initially, when I decided, well, okay, I'm going to turn and I'm going to look at sacred defense works. It's a huge body of work. I started looking at memoirs, novels, blogs, and of course the progenitor of the genre, which is this sacred defense cinema. And at one point I realized, well, that's just a lot. I can't, this is too voluminous. I can't deal with it all at once. I'll just focus on the cinema. And the cinema itself is a very vast body of work. And once I made that decision, I was, of course, playing catch-up. I put all the memoirs and all the other stuff I was looking on hold, and I started to look at some of the works that I had missed out on while my attention was everywhere. And one of the things that I started to notice, so I'm talking about films that are 2013 on, this is where I went to start my catch-up game, I noticed that there was something very different about the films that were coming out after this period. So there were things that were the same. I could recognize it as the cinema of sacred defense. There were thematically continuities, both in terms of the ideals of the early sacred defense, also in terms of some of the internal critiques that the films were offering. But what was different was the orientation of the films, the way that the audience was being positioned in relation to the notion of sacred defense. And what I started to notice is that what was different about the films was, on the one hand, storytelling. There are different kinds of stories that were now being told as stories of sacred defense, but also the ideological function of the works was different. And what the ideological work that these films were now doing was to reframe the concept of defense and to reorient the audience towards justifying Iran's foreign policies, or as well as their domestic policies. But it's a shifting of the notion of defense, and it's a somewhat subtle shifting of the notion of defense. And in order to make that case for you in the short time that I have today, I forgot to turn on my timer. I hope somebody's keeping time. In the short time that you'll let me know, thank you. I'm going to, by way of evidence, provide a trajectory. Of course, it's going to be incomplete, but a trajectory of sacred defense from its nascent and formative years into this into the aughts, and then into the second decade of the new millennium, to show how the core themes were established in the 80s and amid the war. And then by the end of the 1990s, you start to get some appearance of internal dissent, internal critique in the films, but both of these periods, the nascent and the late 90s, are part of what I'm considering the formative years of the genre. And then I'm going to talk about the aughts. That's the time where you see some continuity to the norms that were established in this earlier period. But you also see an expansion into melodramatic films. And it's also a very dull period. There's a lot of very bad films that are made in this time. And there are many bad films in general in this body of work, but there's particularly, there are films that were so bad that they garnered internal critique, even from the same institutions that were supporting these films. And then at the very end, I will make this point about how the new films, and again, I'm focusing post-second decade of the new millennium, shift the reader, not the reader, I'm such a reader, I'm always thinking of reading, shift the audience towards this new notion of defense, and that an ideological shift is happening in this period. So now, the formative years, I really, the only use I'm making of the slides, and part of the reason I kept this slide going, is because I will be cross-referencing. You may be familiar with many, if not all, of the films. There's no time for clips, so it's just really a visual aid more than anything else, but I will point to some of these slides as we go along. Among the hundreds of films and dozens of filmmakers of the sacred defense genre, there are two who have received the most ink and the most scholarly and even mainstream attention. On the nonfiction side is Morteza Avini. This is his work here. And on the narrative fiction side, it's Ebrahim Hatamikia, whose work I'm going to return to throughout this talk. Ironically, Avini, whose documentary series, these are stills from the first 2 seasons of the series. It's called Chronicles of Victory, bless you. 1986 to 1994 is when it ran, and it's credited as a pioneering work in sacred defense cinema. And Ironically, it actually bears the least similarity to the vast body of work that was going to come after it. It was innovative in style, and it was at times experimental, it was poetic, and it has this like very dramatic voiceover narration, but really it provides extensive footage of the battlefield, tons and tons of interviews. These faces are typical of the kinds of faces that you would see volunteers that go down to fight, and also interviews with their families and also ordinary people. Production and distribution of the series on state television did not begin until 1986, when the 63-part documentary series was broadcast on television on a prime hour. What this series proposed, and what the core argument of sacred defense cinema was at this time, was that the Iran-Iraq War was a sacred war. It was different than any other conflict that had come before, and it highlighted the selfless and pious defense of the country by Basiji volunteers and IRGC members. And these were, of course, premises that aligned very well with the newly state-formed Iranian state's claims about what was going on in this period. What Avni laid out in form, it didn't endure, primarily because narrative fiction always wins over documentary, just in all places. But in terms of the themes of self-sacrifice, the spirituality and the purity of intent that it attributed to folks who were going to the front lines, and the idea of a committed defense, those became staples of the genre. On the narrative fiction side, okay, let's see if I can work this. There we go. Avni's counterpart in Making a Mark is Ebrahim Hatamikia. I'm guessing these scenes are familiar to many of you. He also similarly believed in the uniqueness of the Iran-Iraq War and the experiences of brotherhood on the front lines, with his earliest films reflecting that singularity. For the purposes of this background, however, I'm actually going to skip to his work in the later 90s. That's where I'm locating his genre-defining work, both reflecting developments in storytelling and also how he starts to examine the cracks that appear in the social and political unity presented during the wartime. So you actually can see this in his works, in his films as early as 1993. There's a film called From Karkha to Rhine, which shows the difficulties that are faced by veterans in the post-war era, and it also shows that not all veterans, not everybody who went to war was a great guy. Like, one of the most hated characters in that film is the guy who ends up getting asylum in the film. But what was subtle in those early 90s films, it becomes explosively apparent in The Glass Agency. This is a film from 1998. Folks who are familiar with Sidney Lumet's 1975, was it? Yeah, 75 film, Dog Day Afternoon, would recognize the structure of the film as being modeled on that. So in Dog Day Afternoon, the protagonist goes and robs a bank because he's trying to get money for the sex change operation of his partner, and then that devolves into a hostage crisis, and then the police trick him, and then it has a tragic ending. It's the same kind of structure. It's almost identical, except that the main character, Haj Kazem, who's a veteran, runs into his war buddy who needs an operation, or he needs care outside the country. He goes to a travel agency to get him a ticket, turns into a hostage crisis. They get tricked, then somebody calls in a helicopter, and then it ends tragically. Because in this very last scene, his friend Abbas dies without getting the care he needed. There's so much to say about this film. There's so much that has been said about this film. Why did it garner actually garnered a popular audience? Why, for many reasons, such as the level of critique that it lobbed at revolutionaries becoming institutionalized. It's a landmark film. But in terms of my point at hand about the formative years of the genre, these two filmmakers, Avni as a documentarian in the 80s and Hatamikia as a narrative fiction filmmaker, set core defining themes. for the genre. And of course, there's some very obvious tension in these two. I mean, how can you say that these are formative and yet they seem to be at odds with one another? Because Avni is claiming, here are these pure, committed soldiers, and here there's this wonderful ideological project that everybody is involved in, and Hatami Kia is showing the cracks in that system. But they go together, because even in Hatami Kia's film, there is a continuity of people who are committed. It's just that everybody else has sold out, and then there's all these tensions in society. So in terms of developments in sacred defense cinema, the 90s overall produced a strong output of films with depictions on and off the battlefield, experimenting with narrative, genre, and form, taking on political and social issues, and eventually showing the fissures and disagreements in society. But this momentum doesn't last. And as you enter into the 2000s, there's a confusing and dull period for sacred defense cinema. But a few developments merit attention. For one, in the 2000s, sacred defense films begin to pay more attention to the generational aspect of the war and its impacts, specifically how the children of those involved in war suffered the mental and physical costs of a conflict that is now long gone by. In the films of this era, neither the battlefield nor even veterans have center stage. It's the family and family dynamics that are often the locus for examining the legacies of the war. And this includes attention to the experience of wives and mothers in ways that break the mold of the idealized mother or wife who willingly sacrifices her loved ones to the war. The two examples I'm going to use from this period, one is Rasul Mologholipur's M for Mother and Ebrahim Hatami Kia's In the Name of the Father. Both of these films are from 2006. Both of these filmmakers were already established directors in the genre when these films came out. But both of the films also depart from both tendencies in their own filmmaking, but also some of the tropes that were evident in the earlier period of sacred defense genre. In fact, there are many critics inside the country who objected to both of these films because they thought it had gone too far afield of what sacred defense had been up to that point. However, the war looms large in both of those films. There is a lot of moralizing in the films. If you've seen sacred defense cinema, you know that there's a lot of moralizing in general, but the moralizing in these films is a little bit different because the focus is not on the soldiers or the veterans and their dedication and faith, and there is not a grand claim about unity. On the contrary, both of these films expose widening cracks within society among the political class and veterans and inside families. And they both, some in a very implicit way, but they reference regional developments, specifically what is going on in Iraq next door. Most importantly, for the bigger point I'm trying to make, is that they show a lot of confusion about not just the legacies of the war, but also what does filmmaking about that legacy look like. So I'm going to start with M is for Mother. I mentioned at the outset that there's a lot of bad films to be found in this genre, but this is particularly, if I may include some judgmental language here, this is particularly a terrible film. It has a lot of plot holes. It has numerous subplots. There's bad acting. There's bad editing. It runs the gamut of weaknesses. But even these weaknesses are telling because of, again, what they say about the filmmaking in this period and the stance towards the post-war legacy. Unlike films, most sacred defense films, especially up to this period, which will center the lives of male soldiers and veterans, M for Mother's protagonist is a woman who served as a frontline nurse, and she suffers because of her exposure to chemical weapons during the Iran-Iraq War. And her sacrifices as a mother to a disabled child, and we actually are led to believe that her child is disabled because of her exposure to chemical weapons, are the focal point of the film. It's nearly a 2-hour film, and it tries to take up numerous political issues and social issues. It tries to take a stance against abortion, about partner violence, commentary on the post-war generation of politicians, and diplomats in particular. Again, one of the more negative portrayals is the husband, who's a famous diplomat, and he's a terrible person. So it's a commentary, I think, on the rising particular political class, on the sacrifice of mothers. The film is in fact dedicated to all mothers. The active participation of religious minorities in the war effort, and the devastating impact of Iraq's use of chemical weapons. Both of those things, the use of chemical weapons, the last two things, and the participation of minorities, those are mainstays of sacred defense cinema. But because the film is all over the place, those issues end up getting diluted in the overall story that the film tries to show. The drama is similarly, or melodrama, I should say, is similarly high in The Name of the Father, a film that also centers around the legacy of the war and has the same lead actress. Also, instead of the impact of chemical weapons, the source of the damage in this film is unexploded ordinances. In fact, unexploded ordinances that were planted by the Iranian side. The gist of this plot is that this is the opening scene. Well, this is not the opening scene, but this is the scene that we actually see this character. She is the daughter of a veteran, and she's on an archaeological dig where she uncovers a spear, like an ancient spear, a war implement, and then she's very happy, but then there's an explosion. She ends up in the hospital, ends up losing her leg, and about an hour into the film, we realize that her dad, who's this character here, goes back to the field and realizes that he actually set the mine, that the mine that exploded his daughter's leg was set by him, and the film ends with him going back again to the field and trying to demine, I guess is the word, and then as he's demining, he looks up and there are US fighter jets going over to Iraq. So that's the ending of the film. And one thing I want to quickly show, just to go back for 1 second here, in the last, in M for Mother, towards the end of the film, she also dies. And as she is struggling, she can't breathe, she's going down the street. I don't know if you can tell or not, but she's walking by a TV store, and this is Saddam's statue falling, being pulled down. And so both films are referencing this new moment. In this way, The Name of the Father comes full circle in acknowledging the constant state of war that's taken place in the area. It begins with Habiba, the young woman there, finding the ancient sphere and then being injured by a mine, and ends with an effort to find contemporary weaponry. Although more subtle, actually I just said this by pointing, my point was going to be that it's a more subtle reference in the first film, but both films are aware of what's going on next door in Iraq. But as I also mentioned, both of them got very negative attention inside Iran among critics. Unbelievably, I should tell you, M for Mother was Iran's official submission to the Academy Awards. It was not accepted. But my point is that the sacred defense films of this period largely, not all of them, largely, were quite weak. This was acknowledged not just by critics, but by the very institutions that were sponsoring these films, that were running the film festivals. And this dull and confused period of the early 2000s, part of the reason I'm kind of harping on this point is because it throws into relief how different things become in the second decade. And therefore, we have to ask, well, why that big change in the second decade of the new millennium? The main reasons for the injection of energy and resources into the sacred defense cinema of this period can be traced to both domestic and regional developments. Domestically, the 2009 Green Movement brought the state's biggest legitimacy crisis up to that point. And in reaction to that, of course, we all know about the repressive arm of the state, but there was also a massive cultural production push under the name of soft war initiatives. A number of institutions arose in this period that were funding films and posters and television series. At the same time, the state was still reeling from the Green Movement. In 2010, an Iranian nuclear scientist was assassinated on Iranian soil. This would carry on for another 4 years. Actually carried on until 2020. That was the most recent one. But in terms of the period of this that I'm considering here, between 2010 and 2014, 4 Iranian nuclear scientists were assassinated and 1 was wounded. And then, as if that weren't enough for what the state is dealing with, in 2010 you get regionally the start of the Arab Spring in Tunisia. And most importantly for the Iranian state, you have the spread of the Arab Spring to Syria. So Iran became involved in Syria fairly shortly thereafter, but for a long time not a long time, 2 years. In retrospect, it feels like a long time at the time, but Iran denied its involvement in the country, outright denying it or downplaying it. But sometime in 2013, you start to see official expressions of, on websites and in ceremonies that people who have died in Syria are openly honored with the moniker Martyrs Protecting the Tomb of Zainab, which is located in Damascus. So with this open acknowledgement of its, and there's also the rise of ISIS in this period and ISIS attacks in the region, including Iran. With the open acknowledgement of its military actions in Syria, the Iranian state begins to reframe its regional intervention as a defense, and the attacks on Iranian soil, on nuclear scientists, as well as the attacks by ISIS, they get used to argue for a securitized internal policy, but also that becomes a gesture of defense as well. The existing discourse of sacred defense, even though it had this weak period in the early 2000s where nobody knew what the heck sacred defense was even supposed to be, or what are we going to do with this legacy, it's a really convenient and useful shell for reorienting and for fitting in this new argument of defense. The films of this period, I argue, do that work of reframing, and the emphasis of the emphasis on defense, of course, harkens back to early sacred defense cinema, the earliest period. But there's also continuities with the late 90s. So they didn't go all the way back to 1986 and reproduce exactly that language of like, oh, the world is against us. Oh, we're united. There are still continuities with the 90s where you see cracks within the system, where you see the system against itself. So that internal critique persists. But the function has shifted. The ideological function has shifted. It's no longer about memorializing the war or interrogating its legacy, but it ends up like a very useful scaffolding to hold up justifications for Iran's military actions and security actions at home. So defense is no longer a memory, but it becomes an ongoing reality. I think that's one of the biggest changes in the language, in the cinematic and the sort of ideological language of the films. So to illustrate this, I'm going to draw from 2 examples from 2016. On the face of it, they're 2 very different films and by 2 very different filmmakers of differing generations. One of them is Hatami Kia, again, his 2016 film, The Bodyguard, and also a biopic from the post-war generation filmmaker Mohammad Hossein Mahdavian, and that film is called Standing in the Dust. Once I start talking about them, you'll see how distinct they are from one another, and they I should mention, there's one important thing I should mention before justifying why I've chosen those 2 for you. Both of them are funded by the Oj Foundation. The Oj Foundation is an IRGC-linked organization that arises in that post-2009 soft war period, but they really start being active post-2013. They sponsor a lot of the films of this period up to recently are funded by them, but also TV shows. We were talking about Gondo, that's funded by them. Posters, they have a lot of resources. So both of these films, not these ones, the next ones, are funded by Oj Foundations. So the reason that I'll put my justification up front. The reason I pick these two films is the way that they complement each other in terms of the way that they're reorienting the viewer and they're trying to bring in new audiences, but also because they both are indicative of other subgenres that arise in that period. So one of them is the subgenre of things that are set in the present that explicitly reference Iran's domestic or foreign involvements. And then there's another subgenre of biopics and also films that are about particular events in the past. And those tend to be the most controversial because of the way that they're sort of rewriting history in front of everybody's eyes. But that's a separate issue. So now let me go to The Bodyguard, the first film that I want to talk about in this period. The Bodyguard, that is not a translated title. That's the title in Persian. The Persian version is also called The Bodyguard. And in fact, that word and concept are themselves points of contention from the outset of the film, and they become metaphors for a loss that the film is lamenting. So throughout the film, the term bodyguard is juxtaposed to the Persian word muhafiz, like protector. I mean, in the film, when the subtitled version, they translate it as security, but it doesn't capture. It doesn't capture what's really going on in terms of juxtaposing these two terms against each other. But like from the film's cold open, which is not this, this is after the credits. This term keeps coming up, where am I a bodyguard or am I a muhafiz? Because the muhafiz captures the sort of revolutionary manhood that's slipping away, whereas a bodyguard is a mercenary. He says as somebody for hire, somebody whose heart is not in it. The central plot of the film is that there's this guy, Haydar Zabihi, he's a veteran who's still suffering from both the physical and psychological effects of the war, and he is a security. See, security just doesn't sound the same, but okay, he's security detail for the vice president, and he's been doing that for many years. And so when he's early on in the film, there's an assassination attempt on, this is from that assassination attempt, and he fails to stop it. The vice president, the vice president is injured, and so he starts to like ruminate on it and starts having doubts about what he could have done. Did he not do enough? But at the same time, there's also authorities who cast doubt on his actions, and then he wants to quit. He's just had it, but then he ends up getting reassigned as security for a nuclear scientist. And the young nuclear scientist happens to be the son of his former comrade that was killed in the Iran-Iraq War. And this is one of the scenes, I got ahead of myself. This is one of the scenes where he's talking about, I'm not a bodyguard. I don't think you can see the subtitles here. But the film ends with an assassination attempt on the nuclear scientist that he's been assigned to. Sorry, I lost my place here. Okay. And Haydar ultimately stops the assassination by embracing this young man and taking a bullet for him. And the way that the assassination attempt happens, first there's a bomb on a car, and then he manages to like rip the door off, but then some motorcycles come by and try to shoot him. That's the second assassination attempt. And all of the killings, all the nuclear scientists that were killed in Iran were killed by one of these methods, and this would have been legible to the Iranian audience. In any case, it's only at the end that this young nuclear scientist realizes, oh my gosh, understands his father's generation and their commitments. The protagonist's inner struggles, therefore, overlap with a number of external struggles. So not only is he fighting with the authorities, some of who want to try him for negligence of duty or dereliction of duty, but also with a younger generation. So it's not just this guy that he has tensions with, Haydar, he also has tensions with his own daughter. So the film is at once depicting a crisis of the protagonist and a crisis of the state. All of these and other themes in the film, the veteran battling internally and externally with society he lives in, the veteran with the remnants of war wounds, the generational struggles, the ultimate sacrifice of the protagonist. This is all par for the course. We see this in the films earlier. However, the orientation that the film takes in relation to Iran's contemporary geopolitical stances is what sets this apart, and how these sacred defense tropes are then used to make a case for those politics. The sacred defense here is now oriented to new enemies who have attacked Iranian soil. And again, as I just mentioned, those references are very easy for Iranian audiences to catch. I mean, it opens with the ISIS attacks, and the reference, of course, to the Israeli assassinations of scientists. And it's very telling that the film opens and closes, bookended by these two attacks on Iranian soil. Mahdaviyan Standing in the Dust, the other film from this period that I want to talk about and bring this to an end, because I'm not even sure. Am I doing okay?
5 more minutes.
5 more minutes. Yikes. Okay. I will speed talk through this part. This film, as I mentioned, represents a subgenre of doing biopics of folks from the early revolutionary period, all of them dead, right? Or events that took place that are turning point events. In this case, the biopic is focused on Ahmad Mutawassilian, a commander during the Iran-Iraq War who disappeared in Lebanon in 1982. So, you know, this whole time, my core argument has been, in this later period, the audience is oriented towards regional issues and the defense is redefined. And so you might ask yourself fairly, well, if something that took place in 1982, how is that reorienting the viewer towards a contemporary conflict? But I'll make this case for you as quickly as I can. Because the case that I'm going to be making is that this is still a part of the project of reorienting the concept of defense and justifying Iran's regional presence. Because one of the criticisms of Iranian involvement was, you know, oh, you've had this history of saying that we've always been attacked, we've never attacked, or for the last 250 years or whatever it is. And what these kinds of films do is they show actually the post-revolutionary project. We were always regionally involved, and you know, usually again in this defensive project. So like telling a kid, remember, it was always sort of a broader conflict, and it wasn't just defense against one country. I know you can't read any of this, but I'll tell you why I have these random words up here. It's important to note that this film does not have a plot to speak of. As a biopic in pseudo-documentary form, the director frees himself from the conventions of both plot-driven fiction narratives and documentary standards. In addition, in this work and others, Mahdaviyan has, at least in terms of style and form, he's forged really interesting films that blur the boundaries of fiction and nonfiction. So in this film, this is what the two things are saying. This is before the start of the film. He tells the audience all the audio in this film is documentary audio. None of the images are documentary. So the film is actually very honest with you at the outset that this is constructed. However, although the film informs us of this, the use of Mutawassilian's actual voice alongside with a mise-en-scène that carefully recreates the era the film is set in, as well as the sepia tone of the film that it's shot in, imbue the images with a documentary feel. This is the whole reason I kept the side thing going, just for you to look at these three images. Oh, now you can't actually see those other images. Darn it. I know I'm running out of time, but I really want you guys to see this really quickly. If I randomly took screenshots here, it's very, like the tone, if I took a battlefield image from these films and then Mutawassilian, I don't think you'd be able to distinguish it without doing some digging into what it's about. So you can see in these films and such techniques attempt to bring in younger generations but to do so in a way that is not going to replicate it has the feel of the earlier films, but it's more complex. Like even Motawassilian himself is not a particularly likable character. He's a hero. The film sets him up as a hero, but you see him fighting with his family, with his friends, with comrades on the front line. So it's a more a complex figure that is in contrast to what was seen in the earlier periods. I'm just trying to jump around a little bit because I know I'm running out of time here. I do want to tell you though that the director, he was born in the same year that Motawassilian disappeared, and he's very much a new generation filmmaker, and seems to very deliberately be trying to, with not just this film but his other films, bringing in younger audiences with more sophisticated arguments about the revolutionary project. Okay, Motawassilian disappeared in Lebanon, but Mahdavian never shows Lebanon itself. Instead, the last 7 minutes of the film in which Motawassilian is seen is in Syria as he's leaving the Iranian embassy. And the film actually ends with Motawassilian's siblings and talking about how, well, they just went on with their lives, but their mother is still waiting for him to come back. And the last image of the film, which it's boring as an image, so I'm just gonna have to describe it to you. It's an open door. It works as a clip because it's an open door of the house, and it's a very sort of shaky handheld camera. And this open door is not just an open door, I argue, waiting for the return of Motawassilian himself, but the open-endedness of the revolutionary project, and because the film does cover all the debates about whether or not how should Iran be in the region. That is part of the film's discussions. Okay, maybe I should just wrap it up then, because I had a big concluding paragraph, but since am I out of time? Just do my, okay, great. Okay, so I'll read what I have, and that way it'll give it some closure.
There's no war going on here.
There's no war. All right, so made in a period in which the state is both involved in conflicts in the surrounding region and internally fractured, both Bodyguard and Standing in the Dust can be seen as attempts to suture the past to the present through their central protagonist. These films can also be seen as attempts to connect the war generation with those that have come before. Bodyguard's Haydar is a living symbol of the dying ideals of the revolution and the war, and his death at the end symbolically reconciles the two generations, but does not resolve the problem of the state crumbling from within. Standing in the Dust protagonist, in turn, tries to capture the ideal without being caught up in the profound cracks that have become evident in that ideal over time. I promise I would read from this, but I have to point this out, that in the aughts, even though they showed generational rifts, there wasn't any satisfactory reconciliation of the generations in the way that you see in this later period. Both films show a nation under threat. In The Bodyguard, and that is revealed in the form of threats from terrorists on the border and foreign assassins in the capital. In Standing in the Dust, the threat is a backwards look at a state that is in the midst of a full-blown war and that has been under attack since its inception. Taken together, the films complement one another in making the argument that the post-revolutionary Iranian state has always been, and continues to be under constant threat, thus making the case for Iran's regional involvement and domestic crackdowns. And as such, Sacred Defense cinema in the second decade of the new millennium mobilizes an old defensive war to redefine defense and justify state policies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Niki. This is wonderful. There is indeed a lot to be said about this genre, and we stop here and see if there are questions. I do have questions myself.
Quick question. Yeah, very quick. Hello? Oh.
Yes.
As you said, mentioned earlier, a lot of these war movies, actually the more successful ones, aren't about war. Actually, they're about some other, perhaps more sophisticated topics like, I don't know, social injustice, poverty, discrimination, and so forth. Even romance in some of them, actually. Like the glass agency that you mentioned, and Ikhrajiha, even, the
Common Rise of Comedy in the Night, yes.
Yeah, a lot of those subjects. Has there been a truly, I should say, purely war picture made that was successful? And I know you mentioned a lot of bad ones, terrible ones.
Well, do you mean,
Thanks.
the question I would have to ask you, do you mean successful in terms of what critical reception or popular reception?
Like a box office smash hit, like
Well, Ecuador was a box office hit, okay, I take your point. So, I think part of the confusing thing about sacred defense cinema is that most of it, as you mentioned, is not what we traditionally call war cinema. So a lot of the things that do take place on a battlefield, like Ikhrajiha or Leili Ba Manas. Yeah, Leili Ba Manas. That's a war front film, but it's a comedy. And so if you're asking about box office draw, I can't think of a Battlefront one that was a box office draw, but in terms of critical reception, then maybe some of the early films of Hatami Kia, like the earliest, like The Scout or Mohajer. Right?
Bubana Hermes was a big box office.
Yeah. Oh, was it? Okay. Yeah. So, but again, it's and one thing that contextually is important to remember, and I'm sure everybody knows, is that these films are also competing in the formative years and also in the early aughts with the rise of Iranian cinema, non-sacred defense cinema. So, of course, in the late 90s, the Jafar Panahi, Kiarostami, and then into the 2000s with Farhadi, etc. So there is that tension for that competition for the critical and audience as well.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Thank you for this. It was fascinating. As someone who hasn't seen, I think, any of these films, I was wondering if it was the way that you had taken up your study of them, or if it actually was the fact that there is no enemy. It feels like the enemy is like, I don't know, the forces within us or something. So I wanted to get your take on that. And then just quickly, you were talking about how in the earliest films, they were suggesting that it was a unique war.
Yes.
And I was curious if, like, what other wars, in what way is it unique if they, like, spoke about some other historical wars and how they were different, or how you come up with the uniqueness part?
Okay, thank you for both those questions. I already forgot the first one. There's no enemy. There's no enemy. Yeah, part of it is because the films that I highlighted are, most of them are after the war has ended, and so it becomes more about the legacy of the war. But in the earlier period, there are films that show the Iraqi enemy, and there's been a lot of criticism of those films in the early period, where like the Iraqis who are shown are like fat and lazy and stupid, and then the Iranians are smart and like the Iraqis are cigar smoking and have ties and all that stuff. And then some of the later films, which actually treat Iraqis with more nuance, were then critiqued, like how dare you show these people as humans. So if that's what you mean, like in terms of like the actual enemy, it's rarely seen, but you're right that there is a sort of existential struggle in a lot of these films that's both on the level of the veteran usually, but also the state. And a lot of people who work in trauma studies, I'm not one of them, have looked at the ways that the veterans in Iranian cinema, sacred defense or not, it's always about this trauma that they don't have a catharsis for it, that they're always returning to the site mentally or physically of the trauma. And then your other question, say uniqueness. Some of that was sort of articulated by the state in terms of we're alone and we have this sacred project, this revolutionary project, and we're under attack. But Avni himself was very explicit. There was a scholar whose name I forget who looked at some of the stuff that Avni has written about propaganda, like explaining this is what propaganda is, but I'm not doing propaganda because my cause is the truth, and there's a spiritual. So that's the sense, and it's a spiritual warfare on top of an actual physical war.
Thank you so much for this. That was a beautiful presentation. I just got a whole list of films that I want to watch now.
Are you sure?
I did watch The Bodyguard. I enjoyed that a lot. I appreciated you including that. I'm curious about two things. You mentioned briefly that some of these films were funded by the IRGC, I think around 2009. I'm wondering to what extent the state was actively funding these films from the beginning of this genre to the current day. And that makes me wonder, I guess, how to make sense of the fact that, like, sometimes these films have themes that are contentious, which to me sounds like it goes against the idea of state-funded films. Like, I'm trying to understand how and why the Iranian state would allow films that, for example, like explicitly address women's issues or social justice issues or poverty or that sort of thing. And whether there's a large censorship issue. I know that in other countries in the region, there's a lot of issues around censorship, like any film that's politically contentious essentially gets banned and you can't air it on TV or in the cinema or anything like that. So if you could speak to the funding and censorship, that would be good.
Those are all really excellent questions. The short of it is, yes, they're all funded directly or indirectly by state. What's different is early on, Avni's films are there's different institutions that, under the auspice of the government, let's say, whereas the IRGC is, not it's paramilitary or military. And so that's one of the differences that's why I point to that distinction, because that's within the state structure, as you know, in Iran, is very complex, and there's lots of infighting and organizations that sort of cross purposes. But all along, the films have variously benefited from state funding, including schools of sacred defense filmmaking, which are state subsidized. Your second question of why the heck would the state even fund this, I'm going to take that together with your censorship question, because many of the films that end up getting released, including films that are funded, sometimes are held in a sort of what's the word? They're held before being released because people are fighting about it. And then there are films that are made that then people get really upset. Why did this get funded? Why did this get released? So some films don't come out. So even though they get funding, there are films that won't come out. But then I guess to your question of, well, then what about those that do come out? Number one, I think, and this is why I've always been interested in state-sponsored cultural productions, because they are a lens into what are the internal fractures inside the state. And so some of the films from 2001, Hatami Kyo in particular, it's about settling internal scores as well. So like in M for Mother, the diplomat is a sort of stand-in for this new rising political class, the people who are diplomats who care more about going to the West. They're not revolutionaries. There's another more recent, there was a, what's it called, in Ikhraj, I think? Exodus, the 2018 film by Hatami Kia. That was very much critiqued for what it said, for its depictions, or it was read as an attack on reformists. So there's a lot in these films that are just internal score settling. And so there is still a project. There's still a state project behind it, but which arm of the state? Or the Gondo show. There's a lot of evening of score. So that would be my answer to that.
And on censorship?
Yeah, that is, huh?
A lot of acclaimed movies are also funded by the state. So the state funds a lot.
Yes. And there is censorship. So sometimes some of these films don't come out, or they come out and they're like, don't ever give this guy money again. So.
We have time for one more question.
All right, very quickly on this question of popularity, how many of them are moving to the genre of television? Because that becomes the realm
Yes.
that now most Iranians
Yes.
are consuming.
So do you mean like the Shabakoye?
Yeah, exactly, like sort of these long serials.
Yeah, so television is a whole other thing, and that's why I had to limit, because I think a lot of the stuff that OJ is sponsoring are television series that are getting a popular audience. And some of it has to do with the form, like seriality tends to draw in audiences rather than, like an audience will sit through like 15 hours of a serial but not a 2-hour movie. So some of it is explained by that. I have not really looked at Shabakoye Khanabadagi, like in terms, I haven't been able to explore that distribution network and to understand its impact, but I think it, of course, it has had an impact. And then a lot of these films, you know, are on YouTube. And so that distribution network, you get a lot of, you know, families in the US, like parents, well, let's see what's on it. You know, and some of the later films of Hatamikia, like, you know, the stuff like against ISIS, like it has, oh, this was a great film. I know that guy is a government filmmaker, but that was, you know, this is kind of anecdotally, you kind of hear this stuff. But absolutely, that's a whole other a route that is important in shaping audience responses.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for being here.